My name is Edie Weinstein, and my story is called Meet You at the Gate. I was an inquisitive child. My parents would say that I asked a lot of questions, usually at the dinner table, mostly about sex. This talk is not about sex tonight. Sorry, guys. Sorry to disappoint you. What it is about is beginnings and endings, here and there, now and then, borders and boundaries, but mostly it's about love. When I was, I'm trying to think how old, 8 or 9 years old, my family took a trip to a ranch that was sandwiched in between New York and Pennsylvania. And I was fascinated with the idea that on one side of the street, I was in one physical state, and on the other side of the street, another physical state. After making sure that there were no cars coming, my parents let me stand in the middle of the street with one foot on either side. How cool is that? When I was 13 or 14, we took a trip to Canada. And when we crossed over at Niagara Falls, I wanted to get out of the car to see if the air felt different in a different country. It didn't. But it was pretty fascinating to consider that it could have. Throughout my life, I took a lot of trips, but mostly in my mind. As a writer, as a reader, I have an incredible imagination. So it was a lot of flights of fantasy. When my parents were 65 years old, like a lot of people, they retired. My father was a bus driver. My mother was a switchboard operator. Both were in incredible shape. My dad was a lifelong gym rat, and he had six-pack abs into his 70s. He was hot. I mean, when they moved to Florida, he had a picture taken of him in a gold Speedo. Seriously. And he got embarrassed because some of the women were flirting with him. He stopped wearing the gold Speedo. He wore, a more appropriate bathing suit. My mother had she got a good laugh out of that. So anyway, they retired at 65, hightailed it down to Florida, which for them was paradise. My father continued working in a gym until he was probably in his late 70s, early 80s. And my mom taught senior stretch class, stretching with Selma. Was her class. Nice Jewish couple, Moish and Selma. So anyway, before that happened, they had talked about leaving behind the cold Philadelphia weather and living somewhere where it was warm and tropical. My husband and I liked the idea so much that a year later we followed them down there, moving to a small town called Homestead. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, you remember your fairly recent history. It was where Hurricane Andrew landed. Now, I have to tell you, we were talking about superpowers. I don't know if I call this a superpower, but when we moved to Florida, I hated it. I missed our friends, I missed the change of seasons, and I desperately wanted to move back to the Philadelphia area. I should have asked for a clean, convenient, safe, neat, easy way to move back home, but manifested a hurricane instead. So it blew us back up north, and here we remained. We would go back and forth to visit my parents a couple times, I would say at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And when we first arrived at the airport, they would meet us at the gate. Hugs and kisses and welcomes. And we would go back and forth with them like that for a number of years. My first solo trip down to Florida took place in 1999, since my husband had died December 21st of 1998. And they still met me at the gate. That's all right. Mazel tov. Somebody's getting married. A little, yeah, there we go. So anyway, I took a solo trip down there, and they met me at the gate for one last time. The next couple of years that I went down there, the distance between my arrival and their greeting spread out. Then they would meet me at baggage claim. And then a few years later, they would meet me at the car because my father was developing Parkinson's. And then after that, he would stand leaning against the car, but then after that, he couldn't get out of the car. So I'd lean in and kiss him. And he'd say in his gruff South Philly accent, "I hate to see you leave, doll baby." And I said, "But Dad, I just got here. Let's enjoy our time together while we have it." And so we did. Then my mother drove one last time to pick me up, and my father waited at the condo for me to arrive, sitting on the screen porch. A few years went by, and the last time I saw my father was when my cousin Jody drove us both to the airport, and she came down with me, and we arrived 4 hours before he passed. So we were able to send him on his way. After that, the shuttle became my mode of transportation to visit my mother, who remained pretty vital and pretty active in her life, and told me that she wasn't leaving anytime soon. She had a full, rich life. She had friends. She had things that she loved to do. Then, in 2010, she went into hospice, and a journey began. Now, I'm also a social worker. I've been with people at the time of their passing, so I knew what was coming. And I was really blessed to have had something like 7 visits in the 6 months prior to her passing. And we'd have these amazing, amazing conversations about life, about death. And I'd say, Mom, what do you think happens when you die? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, do you think Daddy will be waiting for you? I don't know. How about, your parents, Uncle Jimmy? Her brother had died probably like 10 years earlier. And her answer continued to be, I don't know. And I said, well, when you do know, please come back and tell me. And she said, I'll come back as a butterfly. We had fantasy trips that we would go on. And one day I said to her, Mom, where are we going today? And she said, Hawaii. We're going to Hawaii. My parents had traveled a lot, but they'd never been to Hawaii. And I said, okay, what are we going to do there? Well, we're going to dance the hula and we're going to get laid. And I knew she meant, and I said, 2 wild women out on the town getting laid. Sounds fine to me, And I said, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Well, we're going to go to a luau, but no roast pork. And I said, okay, a kosher luau. Well, what are we going to eat instead? And she said, s'mores. We're going to have s'mores. And my mother always had a sweet tooth, chocolate being her drug of choice, like mine. And I said, you know what, Mom? I don't think they serve s'mores at luau's, but I bet they serve s'mores in heaven. And she said, I hope so. Now, I haven't heard for sure, but occasionally I indulge in her honor. The last time I saw my mother alive was Halloween weekend of 2010, and she was holding court in her living room as the neighborhood children came to visit her, proud of their costumes, and they had so much more fun in the presence of their surrogate grandmother than they did with the sweet treats that she offered them. As Thanksgiving approached, I knew the time was getting short, and I said, how about if I come visit you that weekend? Oh, no, you don't need to, it'll be fine. And I said, then you realize I won't be down till the very end. And she said, that's okay. Now, neither of us had known how quickly the end would come. I called her several times a day throughout the week and mostly talked to the hospice nurse, who said she's in and out of consciousness. I don't know how long it will be. I called on Thanksgiving, and I had the nurse put the phone up to her ear, and I told her how much I loved her and that I would be with her soon. The next day, November 26th of 2010, I was on my way to my job as a psychiatric social worker, and I called to check in, and the nurse said, it's going to be soon. And I said, do you think I should get down there now? And she said, get here as soon as you can. And then I said to my father, take care of her now. And then I corrected it and said, no, take care of each other like you always have. Less than an hour later, I'm at my desk, and my sister calls, and she said the hospice nurse had just called her and that our mother had just passed. A visceral howl, no, went through me. Even though I knew I had done this work before, even though I thought I had prepared for my mother's death, I wasn't sure I was prepared to live without her. But the cool thing about my parents is that they raised us to be resilient. So I have learned to live without my parents. They're very present with me. Their pictures on my phone. I wear my mother's ring that my grandmother had given her, so it feels like they're always with me. So I'm at my job, and I run into the nurse's station and tell my boss I need to go. And she was aware that this was happening. And she said, I still need you to sit with me and tell me what's going on for your patients so we can take care of everything in your absence. And that was a blessing because I had an hour to sit, because I knew that there was no way that I'd be able to drive in that condition. So by focusing on my work at that moment, I was able to distract myself enough to be able to calm down. I called my cousin Jody, who drove me to the airport. On Route 95, which is the direct route from where I live to the Philadelphia airport, a car pulls in front of us. And there's a sticker on the back of the window, and guess what the sticker was? Butterfly. I get to the airport, and I realize my mother chose the least busy travel day of the year to die, the day after Thanksgiving. The airport was virtually barren. I sailed right through, got right on the plane. I'm sitting on the plane with a book on my lap, spine up, called Glad No Matter What. It was written by an artist and an author named Sark, Susan Ariel Rainbow Kennedy. Anybody here know who she is? Okay, some people do. The flight attendant walks by, bright red hair, name tag says Julie, Jewlee, and I was to find out how quickly what a jewel she really was. She says, "Oh, I love Sark." And I said, "Well, you're welcome to take a look at this book." Now, Sark had written the book after her mother had died, her 16-year-old cat had died in her arms, and she just ended a long-term relationship. So this woman knew grief. And it was about being able to have a life beyond the grief. So I said to Julie, "You're welcome to read this, look through the book while the flight's happening if you don't need to do anything else." So I bring it back to the galley, and she asked me why I'm on the plane, and I told her that my mother had just died, and she starts crying. And I thanked her for her empathy, and she said, "No, it's that, but I'm also crying because a dear friend of mine died something like 2 or 3 weeks earlier." And I tell her the butterfly story. At that, she hitches up her skirt, and on her thigh is a tattoo. Now, not a butterfly, but a close cousin, a dragonfly. And she tells me that, she'll sit with me if need be, and she took care of me during the flight. We've remained close friends, and she flies in and out of Florida to Philadelphia, and on one of her visits, she gave me this scarf. I don't know if you can see, but it's got butterflies all over it. So when I wear it, it feels like both Julie and my mom are hugging me. One of the things that I'm incredibly grateful for is the enduring love that I've experienced with my parents. Now, the last time I flew down to Florida was to sell my parents' condo, which was in 2011. And when I arrived at the airport, there was no one to meet me at the gate. There was no one to meet me at baggage claim. There was no one to meet me at the condo. Prior to that, I forgot to tell you this other part. This is a really important thing. When my sister and I arrived at the airport, the day before my mother's funeral, we were greeted by her neighbor, Diane, who she considered her angel. And she says, "I have to tell you girls this story." She said, "Remember the suit your mother wanted to be buried in?" And I said, "Yeah, it was hanging on the back of the den door. It was this beautiful pink silk suit that she wore at their 50th anniversary vow renewal that I officiated. I'm also a minister, so I officiated at my parents' 50th anniversary celebration." I said, "Yeah, she wanted to wear that beautiful suit." Well, when the undertaker came to pick up her body, I forgot to give them the suit. So Myrna, who is another neighbor, and I were cleaning up the condo in preparation for your arrival. Myrna says to me, "That door just closed by itself. I'm too freaked out to go in. You go in. You check it out." So Diane walks in and says, "Oh, my God, Selma was reminding me I forgot to give the undertaker the suit because it was still hanging on the door." The next day, my sister and I went to the funeral home to prepare for the funeral. Now, this is November in South Florida, not butterfly season. Everywhere were butterflies. The next day was her funeral. They were still there. One of them kept dipping and diving into the gravesite. The day after the funeral, I went to my mother's bank to open up an online page so I could manage her accounts from home. And you know how you have an icon, an image that shows you that it's yours? Right away, guess what popped up when I was picking? And I'm laughing, and the teller is asking why I'm laughing. And I tell him the butterfly story. And he says, there are 3,000 potential images, and this one pops up at random. I said, no, not at random. This is on purpose. So as I had mentioned earlier, there was no one to greet me when I sold my parents' condo. But one thing that I'm absolutely certain about is that when it's my time to depart, they will once again be there to meet me at the gate. Thank you.